Hello everyone, and welcome to a follow-up video about some basic scripting in Unity. In the last couple of videos, we talked about how to write simple scripts that cause output to appear on the console. Today we're going to write our first script that actually affects what's going on in the scene. And we're going to do this in a couple of different ways. The first thing we're going to do is examine how to modify the shape that the script is attached to, and then we're going to see how we get access to other objects and components in the scene. So the important thing to remember, quick review, is that every game object is built up of several components. So we have the transform component. In this case, because it's a cube, we have a cube mesh, a box collider, a mesh renderer, and then our material. We're going to use C# today to access in our code some of these components, specifically the transform component. Remember, the transform component is comprised of three different elements: position, rotation, and scale, and we're going to use the transform component to modify a couple of these elements. So I'm going to make a new C# script, and I'm going to call this object mover, and we're going to make a couple of things happen. So I'm going to open up object mover. I'm going to take a quick look at some of my notes. So the goal here is to access the transform object or component attached to our object. It looks like my script didn't actually open. So let me try this again. Oh, I want to click object mover. There we go. All right, so object mover doesn't have anything going on in it right now. What we want to do is use our transform component to be able to translate and rotate our object. So the transform is something that's built into our object. When we attach the script to the cube has a built-in component called transform that has access to its position, rotation, and scale. So what we want to do in this section is we want to access a variable built in that's going to allow us to use this transform object. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this object mover, I'm going to place it, I'm going to select my cube, I'm going to place my object mover on the cube. So there's our object mover. And now what I need to do is go into my update method, and let's take a look at some of these elements. So there's a built-in field called lowercase transform that means the transform component of this object. So because object mover is attached to a cube, I am accessing the transform of this cube object. And transform has a couple of methods listed here. The first one's called translate. This allows us to specify three floats that represent x, y, and z, and it moves our cube along by that specified amount. So every time update is called, I want to transform this cube. I'm going to call translate. And I'm going to move it half a unit to the right, and then I'm not going to move it up, and I'm not going to move it sideways. This is just saying push it 0.5. Oh, and I use this because C# is silly. So one thing I didn't make a note of last time, let me actually add it to scripting basics. A float is decimal numbers. It always ends with F. So if I'm doing 0.5 F, that means 0.5 floating point number. And translate requires floating points, so that's what I have to do. These guys are okay because they're ints, and ints can be easily converted automatically to a floating point number. So anytime I write a float, I have to make sure I put F after it. Kind of silly, but it's a requirement of the language. So this is going to move it half a unit to the right every time update is called. So I'm going to save this. Let's just make sure that piece works before we do anything. I'm going to hit play. And there it goes. It's gone. All right, let's slow that down a little bit, because that is very, very fast. Let's do 0.1 unit. Try it again. Okay, a little bit slower. That's better. That guy's just going to keep moving to the right forever, because that's what our script has asked it to do. Every frame, we move it 0.1 unit to the right. Let's actually slow this down even more. Let's do 0.05. That'll work. Okay, so that's our translate method. And remember that this transform variable is referring to the transform of whatever object I have attached the script to. So if I instead attach the script to the sphere, then it would move the sphere, because transform refers to this particular object. Now I'm also going to try out the rotate method. Rotate works the same way. The only difference is that I'm specifying which axes I want this to rotate on. So I'm going to do 0.5f, 0.5f, and then 0. So I'm rotating half a unit along the x-axis, half a unit along the y-axis, and I'm not rotating on the z-axis at all while this happens. Let's see what happens here. And now I can see that not only does my cube rotate, it also, or not only does it translate, it also rotates. Notice that translation is relative to the cube. As my cube rotated, the direction of x changed, so the cube kind of curved itself rather than just moving in a single direction. We have to keep that in mind. As we rotate, our relative x, y, and z axes change. So that's pretty simple. Hopefully should be pretty straightforward. Transform refers to this transform component, and we can translate and rotate that component. The next thing I'm going to show you is getting other objects in the scene. So even though this object mover is attached to the cube, I can also use it to get the sphere. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Up here, I'm going to create a public game object, and I'm going to call it sphere. And that's all I got to do right now. I'm just going to create a public game object, call it sphere, and for the moment, I'm not going to need to add any other code. If I go into Unity, then I should see, saved my script, I should see this pop up in my script editor. Public game object sphere. There it is. Okay, I just had to click away and click back again. So notice here that that sphere field now pops up in my object mover, and right now it says none. All I have to do to tell the cube this is what I want you to refer to is select this, choose, go to scene, choose sphere, and there we go. I also can go up here, grab sphere. Oh, I got cube selected though. Grab sphere and drag it into this space. So I can populate public variables just by dragging their the corresponding game object into that field. That's the easiest way, but it doesn't allow me to pick up game objects on the fly. So the first thing I can do for getting other objects, method 1, create a public game object variable and drag the object into the component. That's the easiest way. It's also the least customizable way. It doesn't allow us to programmatically access our objects. I'm going to write some code real quick that does something to the sphere as well. I'm going to have the sphere do something, but now I want to access the sphere's transform. So instead of saying transform.translate, which refers to the cube, I'm going to say sphere.transform.translate. And I'm going to say 0, 0.01f, and 0. So now I'm telling the sphere's transform component to raise itself by 0.01 units every single frame. So now not only am I affecting my own transform, I'm also affecting the sphere's transform. Let's check it out. And remember, because I've dragged sphere into here, that variable should refer to this sphere. Let's try it. All right, and I get both interactions. Cube does what it's supposed to do. The sphere does what it is supposed to do. But let's say I don't want to drag and drop my sphere. Instead of making it a public game object, I'm going to make this guy private instead so that we can't drag stuff into it. And I'm going to get it in another way. Method 2 is call GameObject.get and pass it an object. Or sorry, not get. Find and pass it an object name. Okay, so let's try that. I've got my GameObject sphere, and now in the start method, I'm going to say find the sphere. I'm going to do that by saying sphere equals GameObject.find, and I have to pass it the name of my sphere. So if I go over into my Unity file, I can see that the sphere is named sphere, capital S, P-H-E-R-E. So I'm going to pass it the string sphere. I should end up with the same result, right? If I look back at Unity and I click on my cube, now, oh, this should not show up anymore. There we go. Now, because sphere is private, this field no longer appears, so I have to set it in my code. So my code says, go find the thing in this scene called sphere and set the sphere variable equal to it. Then it'll do its translation. Just make sure we didn't break anything. And there we go. The problem here is that if we have something else called sphere, we won't know how to interact with it. So the other thing that we can do is add what's called a tag. And the tag is a unique identifier for my object. So sphere, the name sphere doesn't have to be unique. I show you guys this technique because it's pretty easy and quick to use if we have only one sphere object in our scene. But method 3 is the most reliable, and it's probably the one we're going to use most often. This method is call GameObject dot, and the method we want is find with tag, leave, and then we pass it our tag name. Now, a tag is a unique identifier that we set up for our object. So for sphere, notice that tag, it says untagged. If I select this and I go to add tag, I can create a tag and call it whatever I want. I'm going to call this tag special sphere, and I'm going to save it. Now I'm going to click my sphere, I'm going to change the tag to special sphere, and now this tag is going to only ever be applied to this sphere. So even if I have 3 or 4 spheres with the same name, they will not have the same tag. Now I can go in here, and my other option for getting this object is saying find with tag, and I'm going to pass it special sphere. My third and final way of selecting a separate game object. Still works. Looks like we're good. The key thing to keep in mind in this code is which transform I'm talking about. So the transform without anything in front of it means the transform of the current object, or in other words, the transform of the object that this class is attached to, which is the cube. So this transform refers to our cube. When I get a new object, though, when I create a game object called sphere and I set it to my sphere in my scene, in this case, I'm getting the transform component that belongs to our sphere. So I'm getting this transform component. That transform component, when I translate it, it applies to the sphere only, and I could rotate it too if I wanted to. But the point is that this is this transform component belonging to the sphere. This is the transform component belonging to this game object. So that's the key difference there. Hopefully you guys can see how we can combine this with the previous video to start doing user interaction. But this has been a quick look at how we can use the transform component to be able to translate and rotate our objects. Thanks for watching.